Welcome to the Life After Sugar podcast. The podcast that's not just about sugar, but about your relationship with it and also with food and especially with yourself. So if you want to discover your life after sugar and hear inspiring stories from all kinds of people who also cut out sugar in their way, at their pace, for their own reasons, this is the podcast for you. Because when you take away the sugar, you can finally discover the real sweetness in your life. I'm your host, Netta Gorman, and my guest this week is Mallory, who has a very touching story about losing her mother when she was very young and struggling with an eating disorder. And Mallory has written a book called Slip, Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. And her recovery is what we talk about in this episode. We'll get to that in just a minute. But first, I just wanted to tell you that if you're looking for some free resources, then I have plenty for you. First, download my 5 tips to get rid of cravings. And those 5 tips may not be what you think they are. So go to aftersugarclub.com and download your 5 tips today. And while you're at aftersugarclub.com, why not take the cravings quiz? I created this cravings quiz specifically to help you start thinking more deeply about what triggers your cravings. And when you do this quiz, you'll get your personalized score as well as my practical tips to help you take your first step to get rid of cravings. Those free resources are at aftersugarclub.com. And also, come check out the Life After Sugar Facebook page and subscribe to the Life After Sugar YouTube channel, as well as my Instagram account at My Life After Sugar, which is where you'll get all kinds of inspiration so that you can see that it's perfectly possible to live a happy and active life, even if you don't eat sugar. You can also check out my TikTok account at Netta_lifeaftersugar. All right, let's get to my chat with Mallory. So today I'm talking with Mallory. Mallory, can you tell us a little bit about your background with food and sugar?
Sure. So I am someone who has lived experience with an eating disorder. So I developed anorexia nervosa when I was 12 years old after my mother had died of metastatic breast cancer. And I really developed the eating disorder because I wanted to stay small in the aftermath of my mother's death. I felt like the more time passed, the farther I felt from her. And I had this idea that maybe if I stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. So for me, food restriction was never about being skinny or attaining the thin ideal, but really about just staying small and safe. But very quickly, the food restriction turned into an eating disorder, and I was diagnosed by age 13 with anorexia. At that point, I was hospitalized and was in and out of the hospital on 5 separate occasions and in residential treatment for a year and a half. And it was a very long period throughout my teenage years of getting treated for the disorder and really trying to learn how I could recover from it. And so my recovery has been long and messy and ongoing. I went through a brief period of thinking I was fully recovered, but then ended up relapsing in college and struggled for about a decade with binge eating and restricting and was caught in this vicious cycle. But in my late 20s, I started to rethink my kind of views on recovery and began to see recovery less as a perfectionistic ideal, but more as an ongoing work in progress. Mm-hmm. And rather than thinking of slips as grounds for failure, I began to think of them as opportunities for growth. Mm-hmm. And that has really helped me to move forward in my recovery. So I still live with the imprints of my eating disorder, and I'm not all better, but I'm so much better than I ever imagined I would be. And I can live a much fuller life than I once could in the past.
Yeah, wow. And Slip is the name of your book?
It is. So, SLIP is really where I detail my personal experiences with the disorder and my recovery from it. But I also surveyed over 700 people with lived experience with all different types of eating disorders and interviewed 175 of those survey respondents, plus clinicians and researchers, to really bring in a lot more depth and to really help educate people on what eating disorders are and how they take shape.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for doing all that work. Very powerful work because, especially for women and girls, and I have a 17-year-old girl, and it's like we're really bombarded with messages about food and what we should eat, what we shouldn't eat, the diet culture. And it's almost as if it creates an eating disorder. And I'd like you to explain to the listeners what the difference is between disordered eating, normal eating, and an eating disorder.
I think it's really important to talk about that because there is a distinction between disordered eating and an eating disorder. Disordered eating may be when you engage in some behaviors around food. Maybe, for instance, you binge eat one day, but it just is a little blip on the radar. It's not something that's repetitive. It's not something that sparks you to have really disordered thoughts, and it's not ongoing. Or it may be that you end up in a period where prior to your wedding, you're restricting a little bit more with your food intake. That would be disordered eating. But if it does not continue, and again, there aren't these repetitive behaviors and distorted thoughts accompanying it, usually then that is just disordered eating, which can come and go throughout a person's life. An eating disorder tends to be more fleshed out in the sense that there are these cognitive distortions that happen around food, around body size, in which a person has a very distorted view of what their body looks like, and also a distorted view of what they are putting into their bodies. So, for instance, I thought that when I was sick, was overweight. And in fact, I was very severely underweight, but I could not see that. I also thought at times I was eating a lot when really I was eating barely enough to sustain my life and my body. And so, because I was trapped in this eating disorder, I couldn't see beyond that. And so, typically, when we talk about people who have eating disorders, they tend to get in these cognitive ruts. And really, the disorder in terms of food, weight, and related concerns takes up the vast majority of their mental space, to the point where it really becomes debilitating and hard to do anything else besides think about the eating disorder and engage in eating disorder behaviors. Certainly, there are also diagnostic criteria that one has to meet in order to clinically be diagnosed with an eating disorder. And so, those different diagnostic criteria will vary depending on the eating disorder. But it's important to just understand that there is a difference. That being said, I did interview people for the book who said that they had disordered eating, but in fact, they realized that they actually had an eating disorder,
Uh,
but they didn't fit the stereotypical mold of someone with an eating disorder, which tends to be someone who's white, young, affluent, female. But many minorities I talked to, some folks, for instance, who are in larger bodies, they in fact would have met the diagnostic criteria for an eating disorder, but they never really sought help, or they didn't think they were sick enough. So I want to just mention that too, that sometimes I think there can be confusion, and sometimes disordered eating can veer into an eating disorder, but someone doesn't necessarily classify it as such.
yeah.
And so hopefully that helps distinguish it. And I would say just sort of normal eating is when you're going about your day, eating the foods that you want, that you feel are good for your body. You're fueling your body. You are not debilitated by kind of thoughts and behaviors that are controlling your food intake in an unhealthy way.
Yeah, 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 that's a great distinction. Thank you. So that's really well explained. And I get the feeling, and this is just from my personal experience and the people that I've interviewed for this podcast, that a lot of us engage in emotional eating uh, just for the fact that processed foods are so readily available, including sugar. Is emotional eating part of disordered eating, or is it normal?
Yes, I would say that it's a little bit of both. So I would say that we all, at one point in time, will likely engage in emotional eating of some sort. Where it becomes more disordered is when there is a feeling of lack of control over it. So, for instance, if you are eating a large quantity of food because you are sad about a breakup or you're really stressed about your workday, and you're eating with an inability to stop and you're doing it in secrecy, those two factors, both the secrecy and the feeling like you lack total control over the food consumption, is when it becomes less normal and more distorted, and disordered. So I think it's important to kind of recognize that sometimes we have a tendency to pathologize emotional eating, and it doesn't always have to be pathologized because sometimes it is just normal where maybe you've had a stressful day and you're hanging out with friends and you decide to just have a bunch of popcorn and ice cream or whatever it may be. But when it veers into those other kind of secretive and out of control behaviors is when you might want to start to take a closer look at the disordered aspects of it.
Yeah, yeah, great. Yes. And I get a lot of people commenting that how I eat, no sugar, no flour, no sweeteners from, out of choice, is an eating disorder. What do you say to that?
It's interesting. I always chuckle a little bit when people have a tendency to diagnose other individuals
Hmm.
without really knowing the full story. And I would say that for individuals who are deciding not to eat certain foods, I don't think that that is an eating disorder so long as that choice is in service of living a healthier life. And so, if those choices make you feel better inside of your body, if they feel like they are enabling you to lead a fuller and healthier life, then I think that that is perfectly fine. I think where it can become concerning is if you veer into a territory where you are really restricting lots of different food groups and you feel as though you have done something morally wrong if you do decide to consume those foods. There is an eating disorder that's classified as orthorexia, which is this
Yes.
unhealthy obsession with healthy foods. And
Yes.
so sometimes it can devolve into that. But certainly what you're describing to me does not sound like an eating disorder.
Yeah, yeah, it's great to, as you say, I don't want to pathologize it or intellectualize it, but it feels sometimes like other people judge you without quite knowing the full story.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. I think it's really important to ask questions and to really recognize that sometimes we can have a very limited view of someone's dietary intake. And so we need to understand it from a fuller perspective before we make any accusations or any judgments about what someone might be doing and what their food intake suggests.
Yeah, totally. And the same can go for intermittent fasting. I deal with a lot of people who feel better eating less often, just don't feel hungry 5, 6 times a day. And they are also judged, as starving themselves, of having an eating disorder. And it just feels like it all gets muddled up.
Hmm. I think it does. And I think that it's important for us to not focus on other individuals and cast judgment, right? And more so to focus on what feels good to us and our bodies. And also to recognize moments when maybe we feel like, I started doing this for what I thought were the right reasons, but now maybe it's veered into a territory where it feels a little more out of control or where it feels like my motives are changing and that I'm only doing this because I want to stay thin, for instance. And so I think just always questioning that and always thinking about your intentions can be important just so that you can recognize if you're noticing any kind of slip into kind of disordered eating or things of that nature.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. And it's really difficult from personal experience. I can tell you it's really difficult to step back and have that kind of distance to be able to recognize that, oh, I think that the reasons why I'm doing this, why I'm eating like this, have changed. And I'm curious to know in your own experience, how did you first realize, was it like despite yourself because you're a child that you were diagnosed, or did you realize that you had a problem? I want to take a quick break to say that if this is your first time here, then welcome and thank you for listening to this podcast. And whether you're new or a regular and you haven't yet rated or reviewed this podcast, could I ask you to scroll down and tap on the stars to rate this podcast and also to write a short review to let me know how this podcast is helping you in your life after sugar. I love reading your reviews. And when you rate and review this podcast, not only does it encourage me to continue making new episodes, but it also helps to share this podcast and have more people see it so that we can help more people feel better and lose weight with less sugar. So again, thank you for rating and reviewing this podcast and for spreading the word about sugar.
So I knew that something was off, but I didn't have the words to describe what it was. I knew of eating disorders, but I did not think that I had anorexia because I was under the misconception that people with anorexia didn't eat anything at all. And it makes sense as a 12-year-old that I would think that. And my father, who was my primary caretaker at the time, he really did not know much about eating disorders. And his only point of reference was the death of American singer-songwriter Karen Carpenter, who had died in 1983 due to complications from anorexia. And so I interviewed him as part of writing this book, and he had said that he thought only adults were affected by anorexia. But he knew certainly that my food restriction was out of the ordinary. And he was concerned because I was losing weight and I already lived in a smaller body. And so he had taken me to my pediatrician on two separate occasions. The pediatrician really did not know anything about eating disorders and dismissed my food restriction and weight loss as a passing phase.
Wow.
And so that was really challenging because we know from research that the sooner someone receives treatment, the better the prognosis. And so I was struggling for almost a year. And then my father found out about Boston Children's Hospital in Massachusetts, where I grew up, and realized that they had a specialized eating disorder unit. And so he took me there, and they took one look at me and my vitals and ended up admitting me to the hospital that evening and gave me the official diagnosis of anorexia, which was daunting to hear that I had this disorder, but it also was helpful in the sense that finally we had a name for what it was I was struggling with.
Yeah, yeah. And all the more power to your father for, not giving it up and not being like fatalistic and saying, well, I know what's wrong with her.
Exactly, because I think it can be easy to miss warning signs, but also to just dismiss it or to not know what to do. And sometimes that uncertainty around what to do can lead to inaction. And so I do really credit my father for being persistent and trying to find help. And I think it's a reminder too that sometimes people struggling with eating disorders may not get help the first time they seek it or ask for it. And so I think part of it is just recognizing that if you feel like you are struggling with an eating disorder or even disordered eating that you are afraid might become an eating disorder, it's really critical to seek care from providers who recognize that and who are wanting and willing to help you.
Yeah, yeah. It's pretty surprising that your pediatrician didn't pick up on it or didn't know much about it.
Yes, I was really intrigued by that. And I looked into a lot of the research around eating disorders, talked with many medical doctors, and learned that research shows that doctors still today get 0 to 2 hours of training on eating disorders, which is just mind boggling to me as someone who nearly lost my life to anorexia. And when you consider the fact that 30 million Americans will struggle with an eating disorder at some point in their lifetimes, it just seems that we need so much more training and awareness. There is a lot of training in med schools around obesity, but there's not nearly as much about eating disorders. And because of that, there are a lot of people who don't necessarily get the help and the treatment that they need because they don't look the part of someone with an eating disorder. So that just creates one more barrier to care, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm curious to know, the people that I help stop eating sugar so they can get rid of cravings and everything else that comes with it, when they do reduce or stop sugar, they are faced with all the difficult, uncomfortable emotions that they were using sugar to like smother, and numb. And so you had a very traumatic experience of losing your mum early on in life. How did you cope without, like, once you had the eating disorder under control, how did you actually deal with the pain?
Hmm. It's such a good question because in the immediate aftermath of my mother's death, I really did not deal with it at all. I put on a really happy face and I went to school the next day and pretended I was okay. I
Mm.
read my mother's eulogy at her funeral and didn't cry. And beneath that happy facade, I felt like I was crumbling and eventually fell into the eating disorder. But a big part of my recovery was learning how to grieve my mother's death and how to feel a lot of those emotions of anger and resentment and frustration, and giving myself permission to feel those things. And also looking for ways to remain close to my mother, recognizing that I thought the eating disorder would serve that purpose, but in fact, it didn't. And it left me feeling farther than ever from my mother. But I had to think about all of the different ways in which I could still carry out my mother's memory and legacy. And so I very often would write letters to her in my recovery, and I would look at pictures of her and tell stories about her. Still today, I write a lot of personal essays that include her, and she's a character in my book. And so I have found other ways of maintaining these continuous bonds with my mother, even though she's no longer here. And I also had to cope by recognizing that the eating disorder was not a coping mechanism or not the solution to the problem, but really the problem itself. And I think part of why I also was attracted to the eating disorder when I was younger is because in the aftermath of my mother's death, because I didn't really ask for help, it wasn't until I started losing weight and got really sick that I did get help and attention, right? And people
Yeah.
noticed, oh, Mallory looks like she's in need of care and love and attention. And so part of my recovery and overcoming this sort of lack of grief was really grieving, but also recognizing the ways in which I was special apart from my eating disorder.
Yeah, yeah, that's very powerful. And in my program, I actually created an assignment, an exercise, applying the 5 stages of grief to sugar, because it is a grieving process, obviously not the same as what you experienced with the loss of your mother so young, but anything like that loss requires us to actually process the feelings. And goodness knows, it's probably one of the last things we want to do as adults, let alone as a child.
Yes, very much so. And I think for me, it was just a lack of understanding of what the grieving process was even supposed to look like. I mean, I really thought that you grieved someone for a day or a week and then you were supposed to be over it. And I recognize now that that is so far from the truth. But I think too, for me, it was a matter of recognizing that I didn't have to arrive at this place of closure. I think that when I was little, I used to think, well, I'm supposed to be over my mother's death, but I still carry the weight of that loss as a 40-year-old and as a mom myself. Certainly, the load of that loss has lightened, but it's still a weight that I carry and shoulder. And so I think just important to recognize that sometimes we think that there's this grand finale or finish line we have to cross, but in fact, a lot of times it's just still something that we have to live with, right? And we just hope that over time that load lightens.
Totally. Yeah, it's definitely a process and it can be a lifelong process. Yeah. And so, can I ask, what you eat now? Do you consider that you eat normally, or have you had to kind of make some kinds of tweaks to your diet?
Yeah. So I try to eat when I'm hungry and stop when I'm full. I do recognize, though, just that I still live with the imprints of my eating disorder. And so I do have a tendency still today to think that I've eaten too much when in fact sometimes I haven't eaten enough. And so food restrictions still is something that my brain goes to when I'm stressed or when I'm in just difficult situations. And so I have to try to really be cognizant of that so I can make sure I am eating enough and fueling my body. I am a vegetarian, and I'm a vegetarian for a lot of different reasons, including the fact that I've never really loved eating meat, and there's the animal ethics component of it. But there also is a little bit of food restriction underlying that. And I've written essays about the fact that in some ways it still feels like a way to hold on to the eating disorder. But that being said, I also really enjoy a lot of vegetarian foods. I love tofu and just lots of kind of stir fries with veggies and rice. And there's so many great vegetarian dishes that I've discovered. So I don't feel like I'm missing out all that much by not eating meat. But in my head, I'm always sort of walking this fine line of thinking, okay, do I need to pathologize the vegetarianism, or is this just a lifestyle that I enjoy and that I want to embody? So still today, that's just a question that I grapple with in my recovery. But I've been a vegetarian for about 17 years now, so quite a long time.
Okay, all right, yeah. And do you tend to see like all foods as having similar value, or do you like stay away from certain foods apart from the animal products?
For me, it's been really important, at least just given my history, to just try to neutralize foods. So I think about this a lot just as a mother of a 7-year-old son and 9-year-old daughter. When I talk with them about food, I don't label foods as good or bad or healthy or unhealthy, only because I know when I was younger, I was exposed to that terminology in school. And I ascribed moral values to food because of that. So I would think, well, I'm bad if I eat bad foods, or I'm good if I eat good foods. And as a people pleaser and perfectionist, I really thought I needed to stay away from the quote unquote bad foods that my health teacher was telling us about. So I think that whatever language we individually use to talk about food is fine if it feels right to us. And so for me personally, I do try to just have this mentality that all foods fit and food is fuel. And so I try to kind of leave some of the emotionally charged aspects out of it. And part of that for me is just eating disorder prevention speak, because I really want my kids to grow up to be exposed to different foods and to not end up with the disorder that took over my life for so many years.
Yeah, yeah. And let's hope not to have the experience that you had so that they have their mum for years and years to come.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Mallory. If someone wants to get your book, how can they do that?
Yeah, so I hope your listeners will check it out. It is about eating disorders, but also about loss and grief and parenthood. So lots of different themes wrapped up in there. But it is available really wherever you buy books. So it's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble's website, local independent bookstores throughout the US have it. So you should be able to relatively easily find it.
All right, thank you. And I'll put the link to it with the show notes for this episode. And thank you for talking to me, Mallory. You're very inspiring.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me, Netta.
Wow, such a touching and inspiring story that Mallory has. And I'm sure that many of us, even those of us who didn't actually experience an eating disorder, I'm sure that many of us can relate to this emotional connection, this emotional relationship that we have with food. And I don't know about you, but I remember using food as a source of comfort or as a source of reward or to help me when I was feeling tired or annoyed or any type of emotion. So, no judgment here. We all do it. And I'm just impressed at Mallory's ability to express what her lived experience was and then to turn it into a book. And I kind of did the same thing, except I turned my lived experience into a coaching program called the Freedom from Cravings Formula. In the program, you'll get step-by-step guidance and customized support through the 5-step formula that I've developed to help you get control over cravings so that you can finally live your life with more energy and fit into your favorite clothes effortlessly, and feel confident in your food choices so that you can ditch the shame and embarrassment that you feel every time your emotions make you slip or fall off the wagon, and so that you never feel like you're on some kind of restrictive diet. If you're at the stage of your life when you're finally ready to look after yourself, let's chat. You can talk directly to me on a free clarity call at any time by going to aftersugarclub.com and clicking on Program at the top. You'll also find the link with the show notes together with this episode. So go to aftersugarclub.com. Speak to you soon. That's it for this week. Keep in touch and see you soon for another episode.